Let the world outside fade away. Let the gentle hum of the cosmos be the only sound. We are about to enter a dark room to watch a single beam of light reveal the secrets of the universe. We left our story at a pivotal moment. The great intellectual fire of the classical world had not been extinguished, but carried east, where it was tended and fed in the vibrant centers of the Islamic Golden Age. We spoke of a bridge, a figure who would connect the ancient world's philosophical ponderings with the modern world's demand for evidence. Now let us walk across that bridge. Let us meet the man. His name was Abu Ali al-Hasan ibn al-Hasan ibn al-Haytham, born in the year 965 in the bustling port city of Basra, in what is now Iraq, a city of merchants and scholars, alive with the exchange of goods and ideas. He was a brilliant student, devouring texts on mathematics, physics, and philosophy, and he began his career in the civil service, serving as a judge, but a deep restlessness stirred within him. He was troubled by the endless conflicting religious debates of his time. He saw people building their truths on inherited dogma and passionate rhetoric, rather than on firm, observable foundations. He grew disillusioned and made a quiet, profound decision to turn his back on public life and dedicate his entire being to the pursuit of scientific truth, to knowledge built not on opinion, but on certainty. His reputation for genius grew, and soon it reached the ear of a figure of immense and eccentric power, the Fatimid Caliph of Cairo, al-Hakim, bi-Amr Allah. The Caliph was a patron of the sciences, but he was also a man of grandiose, sometimes dangerous ambition. He summoned Ibn al-Haytham to Egypt with a monumental challenge: to do what generations of pharaohs had only dreamed of, to build a dam on the river Nile, to regulate its annual, life-giving, and often destructive floods. Ibn al-Haytham, armed with his knowledge of engineering and mathematics, traveled south along the great river, but as he surveyed the immense, powerful waterway and the vast landscape, a terrible realization dawned upon him. The tools and materials of his time were simply no match for the colossal scale of the project. It was impossible. He now faced a terrifying dilemma: to return to the Caliph and admit failure was to risk the wrath of a notoriously unpredictable and merciless ruler. Execution was a very real possibility. And so, in a desperate act of self-preservation, Ibn al-Haytham chose a different path. He feigned madness. He began to act erratically, his words nonsensical, his mind seemingly broken. The ruse worked. The Caliph, convinced the great scholar had lost his wits, spared his life. But he was stripped of his possessions and placed under strict house arrest, a prisoner in a quiet home in Cairo. This confinement lasted for a decade, from roughly 1011 to 1021. For another man, this might have been a decade of despair, but for Ibn al-Haytham, these quiet, solitary years, with the bustling world shut out, became the most intensely productive period of his life. His body was confined, but his mind was free to roam the cosmos. And it was here, in this forced stillness, that he turned his full, formidable intellect to one of the most ancient and profound mysteries of all, the nature of light and the miracle of vision. For over 1,000 years, the question of how we see had been settled, at least in the minds of the great Greek thinkers. The dominant theory, championed by giants like Euclid and Ptolemy, was called the extramission theory. It proposed that vision worked by sending something out from the eye. Our eyes, they believed, emitted invisible, ethereal rays that shot out and touched or felt the objects around us, much like a blind person's cane explores the world. It was an idea that felt intuitively correct. It made the eye an active, powerful organ, reaching out to grasp the world. But Ibn al-Haytham, sitting in his quiet confinement, began to dismantle it with pure, inescapable logic. If we see by sending out rays, he reasoned, why does looking at a very bright light, like the sun, cause us pain and even damage our eyes? Surely the sun is not injured by our weak eye beams. Why can we see the distant stars the very instant we open our eyes in the dead of night? How could our rays travel across such an immeasurable distance instantaneously? And why, he pondered, do we see reflections in a mirror, but we cannot feel the smooth surface of the glass with our supposed eye rays? The theory, when prodded, began to fall apart. He proposed a radical alternative, a theory of intromission. The process, he argued, was exactly the opposite. We do not send anything out. We are passive receivers. Vision happens because light rays originate from objects themselves and travel into the eye. He made a crucial distinction. There is primary light, which shines from self-luminous bodies, like a candle flame or the sun. And there is secondary light, which radiates from objects that are merely illuminated, like the moon, or the wall of a room, or the page of a book. But in every case, he asserted, from every single point on the surface of every object we see, light rays stream outwards in all directions, and they travel in perfectly, unbendingly straight lines. This was a bold claim, a powerful theory. But for Ibn al-Haytham, logic alone was no longer enough. A claim about the physical world must be proven in the physical world. He needed to move from philosophical speculation to empirical demonstration. He needed to bring the universe into his room and force it to reveal its secrets. But how? How do you prove that something as ethereal as a ray of light travels in a straight line? You cannot see the ray itself, only its source and its destination. You cannot lay a ruler alongside it in the empty air. The challenge was immense. It required a new way of thinking, a new way of questioning. Ibn al-Haytham's great insight was this: to understand the behavior of light, you must first control it. You must strip away all the complexities of the sunlit world, the reflections, the scattered glows, the ambient haze. You must create an environment of perfect, absolute simplicity. You must start with darkness. And so, he turned his room of confinement into the world's first true optical laboratory. He would have blocked the windows, sealed the cracks around the door, hanging heavy cloth until the room was plunged into an inky, impenetrable black. He called this space al-Bayt al-Mudlim, the dark room. In this profound darkness, his senses would have heightened. The scuff of his own shoes on the stone floor, the scent of dust and old papyrus, the sound of his own steady breathing. This was not just a room. It was a controlled universe of his own making, a universe in which he was the sole creator, and light was his only subject. Now, the experiment could begin. Imagine him. He takes a single candle and places it on one side of the room. On the other side, he hangs a white screen or simply uses the smooth plastered wall. In between the two, he places a partition, a simple board with a single tiny hole drilled through its center, an aperture. He lights the candle. The darkness is broken, and there, on the white wall opposite, a single small spot of light appears. This in itself was not new, but Ibn al-Haytham was not just looking. He was interrogating. He would have taken a long straight rod or a taut string. He would have touched one end to the flickering candle flame, passed it through the tiny hole in the partition, and found that the other end landed precisely on the spot of light on the wall. The path was a perfect straight line. He moves the candle up. The spot of light on the wall moves down. He moves the candle to the left. The spot moves to the right. Always, the relationship was perfect, predictable, and linear. The light was not curving. It was not diffusing aimlessly. It was marching in a straight, unwavering line from its source, through the aperture, to its destination. But one candle was not enough. The universe is filled with countless sources of light. So, he expanded the experiment. He placed a second candle next to the first, but at a slightly different height. A second, distinct spot of light appeared on the wall, in its own predictable place. He lit a third, and a fourth. Each candle created its own independent messenger of light, its own spot on the wall. This was the critical moment. In the space between the candles and the partition, the light from all four sources was mixing, crossing, and filling the air. Yet after passing through the tiny aperture, the rays unscrambled themselves. The light from the top candle still went to the bottom spot. The light from the leftmost candle still went to the rightmost spot. The rays had crossed paths without disturbing each other in the slightest. They did not collide and scatter. They did not blend into a meaningless blur. Each ray followed its own sacred linear path, as if it were completely alone in the universe. To seal his proof, he performed one final, elegant test. He would simply take his hand and shield one of the candle flames. In that instant, its corresponding spot on the wall would vanish into the darkness. He would remove his hand, and the spot would reappear. Cause and effect. The connection was absolute. Light was a physical entity that traveled, and its path was as straight as a geometer's line. He explored this further. What about color? Was color something our eyes projected onto the world? He would have placed a piece of colored glass in front of one candle. The corresponding spot on the wall would now glow with that color. Color was not a property of the eye. It was a property carried by the light itself, and it too traveled in this unwavering straight line. He even contemplated the journey itself. His logical mind told him that for light to travel from the candle to the wall, it must take time. The journey could not be truly instantaneous. It was a process. He would have experimented by covering and uncovering the aperture with his hand, watching the spot of light appear and disappear. While his tools were far too crude to measure this stupendous speed, the very act of the experiment framed light not as a static, omnipresent state, but as a phenomenon in motion, a flux, a stream that had a beginning and an end to its journey, however brief. Let us pause here and appreciate the profound shift that has just occurred in this dark room. This was more than just an experiment with candles. This was a new kind of conversation with the universe. For millennia, philosophers had tried to deduce the nature of reality through pure reason, from the top down. Ibn al-Haytham had just demonstrated a new path to build truth from the bottom up, from simple, repeatable, undeniable observations. He had not relied on the authority of Aristotle or Ptolemy. He had relied on the authority of the light itself. In the quiet of his confinement, he had forced light to draw its own self-portrait, and its signature was a straight line. He now had the key, and with this key, he was ready to unlock an even greater mystery, the Camera Obscura, and the secret of the human eye itself. The line was straight. The path was true. Ibn al-Haytham had proven this with the humble light of a candle. But he was an astronomer. as well as a physicist. His mind was accustomed to thinking on a grander scale. What about the greatest light source of all? The sun. To study the sun directly was impossible. Its brilliant, painful glare overwhelmed the eye, turning inquiry into injury. But he now had a tool, a method, born from his dark room experiments. He realized that the tiny aperture was more than just a way to isolate a single ray of light. It was a window, a safe window, through which the universe could project itself. This was the true birth of the device we now call the Camera Obscura, from the Latin for dark room. But for Ibn al-Haytham, it was always al-Bayt al-Mutlim, his laboratory, his sanctuary. He would have known that a solar eclipse was predicted. This celestial event, which had once stopped battles and been seen as a terrifying omen, was for him a unique experimental opportunity. An eclipse was the universe performing a controlled experiment for him. On a normal day, the result was simple. The light from the perfectly round sun passed through the small round hole and projected a perfectly round image onto the wall. But what would happen when the moon began to slide in front of the sun, taking a bite out of its perfect disk? As the eclipse began, something magical happened on the wall inside his room. The projected circle of light began to change. A dark notch appeared on its edge. As the moon crept further across the sun, the image on the wall transformed into a perfect, glowing crescent, a sickle of light, hanging in the artificial darkness. The shape of the sun in the sky was being perfectly replicated on his wall. But there was a crucial detail, a detail that confirmed everything. The crescent on the wall was upside down. If the moon was covering the top of the sun, the crescent on the wall pointed upwards. If the moon covered the sun from the left, the crescent on the wall curved to the right. The image was inverted. Why? His candle experiments had already given him the answer. The light rays were not bending. They were not curving. They were traveling in unwavering straight lines. The ray from the very top of the sun traveled through the tiny hole and continued in its straight path until it hit the bottom of the wall. The ray from the bottom of the sun passed through the same hole and landed on the top of the wall. The aperture acted as a pivot point, a crossing. The Camera Obscura was not creating a new image. It was simply gathering the light that was already there and organizing it. He explained that every illuminated point in the universe, every point on the surface of that crescent sun, was spraying out light rays in all directions, like an infinite number of tiny spheres. Most of those rays simply fly off into space or hit the partition and are blocked. Only a tiny, select few, those traveling on the precise path to pass through the single tiny hole, are allowed to continue their journey to the wall. And because they continue in a straight line, they reconstruct the object that emitted them, point by point, preserving its shape and color, but inverted. He wrote about this phenomenon in a treatise called Maqala fi Surat al-Khusuf, on the form of the eclipse, and he stressed, with the conviction of a true experimentalist, that this was not a one-time wonder. It was a repeatable, verifiable truth. These experiments, he wrote, can be tried any time. This was not philosophy anymore. This was physics. With the behavior of light now firmly established, Ibn al-Haytham turned his gaze inward to the most complex optical device of all, the human eye. And it was here that he made his most breathtaking intellectual leap. He looked at the anatomical drawings of the eye, passed down from Greek physicians. He saw the pupil at the front, a small opening. He saw the globe of the eye behind it, a dark chamber. And it struck him with the force of revelation. The eye is a camera obscura. It was a perfect analogy. The pupil is the aperture. The dark interior of the eye is the darkened room. The light from the world does not just magically appear in our consciousness. It must enter through that tiny opening, just as the sunlight entered his room. And if it follows the same laws, and why shouldn't it, then the image it forms inside the eye must also be inverted. The world, as it is first received by our bodies, is upside down. This was a staggering concept. He integrated this physical principle with the most detailed knowledge of anatomy of his day. He described how the light, after passing through the pupil, falls upon a part of the eye he called the crystalline humor, what we now call the lens. This lens, he noted, further focused the light, creating a sharper image on the sensitive membrane at the very back of the eye, a membrane connected to the optic nerve. Vision, he argued, was a chain of events, a physical process. First, light travels in straight lines from an object into the eye. Second, an inverted image is formed at the back of the eye. Third, the optic nerve transmits a signal from this membrane to the brain. And finally, in a place beyond physics, in the seat of judgment and perception, the brain interprets this signal, correcting the inversion and giving us the stable, upright, and seamless experience of sight that we take for granted. He had connected the external world of physics to the internal world of biology and even psychology. He addressed long-standing puzzles. Why don't we see a blurry mess if every point of an object is sending out infinite rays? Because, he reasoned, the lens of the eye preferentially focuses the rays that strike it perpendicularly, head-on. The oblique rays are refracted, weakened, and contribute less to the final image. He created a holistic model of vision that was so powerful, so comprehensive, and so correct in its essential principles that it would remain the foundation of our understanding for the next 600 years. In that single, powerful analogy, the eye as a camera obscura, Ibn al-Haytham unified the heavens and the self. The same simple, elegant law that governed the projection of a solar eclipse in a dark room also governed the intimate, personal miracle of a human being looking at a flower. The universe was not divided into a set of different rules for different phenomena. There was one physics, one set of laws, and they could be discovered not through ancient authority, but through the patient, humble, and brilliant act of observation in a dark room. He had lit a new path forward. But this path was not just a straight line. It was a complete methodology, a revolutionary way of thinking that was perhaps even more important than his specific discoveries about light. For centuries, natural philosophy had operated like a debate club. A thinker would propose a grand logical system, like Aristotle's, and others would argue for or against it using rhetoric and further logic. The final appeal was always to the internal consistency of the idea, or to the authority of the person who proposed it. Ibn al-Haytham shattered this tradition. What he practiced in his quiet confinement was something startlingly new, something we can recognize across the chasm of 1,000 years. It was the scientific method in its nascent form. Let us trace its steps, as he himself would have. First, there is observation. He began not with a theory, but with a simple, puzzling observation. Looking at the sun hurts. Stars are visible instantly. The world is full of phenomena that the old theories could not adequately explain. He observed the world with a critical, questioning eye. Second, there is the problem. He clearly defined the question he sought to answer. How does vision work? Is it extramission or intramission? What is the true path of light? He did not try to solve everything at once, but isolated a specific, answerable problem. Third came the hypothesis. Based on his initial thoughts and logical arguments, he formulated a clear, testable proposition. Light travels in straight lines from objects into the eye. This was not a final truth, but a starting point, an idea to be challenged. Fourth, and this is the revolutionary step, was experimentation. He did not just think about his hypothesis. He designed rigorous physical tests to try and break it. His dark room, his candles, his partitions, his camera obscura, these were all tools designed to put his hypothesis to the test in a controlled environment, an environment where the universe could only answer yes or no. Fifth, there was the analysis of results. He meticulously recorded what he saw: the spots of light on the wall, the inverted crescent of the eclipse. He analyzed the geometric relationships, applying the rigorous logic of mathematics to his physical observations. He saw the patterns, the unwavering consistency that pointed toward a universal law. And finally, there was the conclusion and publication. He drew a firm conclusion based on his evidence. The intromission theory was correct, and he did not keep this knowledge to himself. He compiled his findings into his magnum opus, a vast 7-volume treatise called Kitab al-Manazir, the Book of Optics. In its pages, he did not just state his conclusions. He meticulously described his experiments, step by step, so that anyone, anywhere, could replicate them. He was inviting the world to not just believe him, but to test his claims for themselves. This was the ultimate break from the old world of authority. The truth, he was saying, does not belong to a person. It belongs to the evidence. The visuals slowly expand outward from the eye. We see a map of the medieval world. Faint lines of light begin to trace paths from Cairo westward into Moorish Spain, and then slowly, tentatively, northward into the heart of Europe. The lines represent the transmission of his book, and the world, eventually, would listen. For a time, his work was celebrated primarily within the Islamic world, but the currents of trade and intellectual exchange are relentless. Sometime in the late 12th or early 13th century, the Book of Optics found its way into Spain, where it was translated from Arabic into Latin, the scholarly language of Europe, under the new title, De Aspectibus, or sometimes Perspectiva. Ibn al-Haytham's ideas began to filter into the monasteries and newly forming universities of a reawakening Europe. It arrived like a seed from a distant land, planted in fertile new soil. European scholars, who for centuries had been studying the world almost exclusively through the lens of Aristotle, were stunned. Here was a work of ancient authority, for he was often mistaken for a Greek or Roman, but one that spoke a new language, a language of experiment, of mathematics, of direct engagement with the physical world. Thinkers like the English friar Roger Bacon in the 13th century were electrified by it. Bacon championed Ibn al-Haytham's experimental approach, calling for a new science based on observation and mathematics. He conducted his own experiments with lenses and light, directly inspired by the translated text. Others, like John Peckham and Vitello, wrote their own commentaries on optics that were, in essence, elaborations and extensions of Ibn al-Haytham's foundational work. The influence was profound, but it was a slow burn. The ideas were spreading, hand-copied from manuscript to manuscript, a quiet revolution taking place in scattered scriptoriums, but the spark had been lit. The principle that a scientific idea must be answerable to physical proof was now loose in the world. The impact rippled beyond what we would now call science. Artists of the Renaissance, obsessed with creating more realistic, three-dimensional representations of the world, discovered the camera obscura. Leonardo da Vinci described it in his notebooks, understanding its function as a tool for accurately capturing perspective, a direct consequence of the rectilinear propagation of light that Ibn al-Haytham had first proven. The laws of optics became the laws of art. Centuries later, when Johannes Kepler was struggling to understand the orbits of the planets, he first had to solve the problem of how the eye functions as an astronomical instrument. He built directly on Ibn al-Haytham's work, refining the model of the eye and definitively showing how the lens projects an inverted image onto the retina. Only by understanding the instrument could he trust the data it provided. From Kepler's work on optics came the invention of the modern telescope. From the principles of lenses came the first spectacles, changing the lives of millions. And centuries after that, the camera obscura itself, once a tool for observing eclipses, would evolve with the addition of light-sensitive chemistry into the photographic camera. Every photograph ever taken is a direct descendant of the experiments conducted in that dark room in Cairo. In 1572, the great work was finally printed, making it widely available for the first time. The man, Ibn al-Haytham, had been dead for over 500 years. His name, often Latinized to al-Haytham, was known only to a handful of specialists, but his ideas, the straight-line travel of light, the intermission theory of vision, and most importantly, the unwavering insistence on empirical proof, had become so deeply woven into the fabric of scientific thought that they were almost taken for granted. He was the quiet source of the river that would become the scientific revolution. He was the ghost in the machine, the father of modern optics, who had shown the world how to see, not just with its eyes, but with its mind. He had perfected the first and most fundamental tool of physics, the art of asking a question, and patiently, humbly, waiting for the light to provide the answer. For over 800 years, Ptolemy's geocentric model of the universe had been the unshakable astronomical truth. Its complex system of epicycles and deference was a mathematical marvel that successfully predicted the positions of the planets. But Ibn al-Haytham was not content with a model that merely worked. He demanded a model that also made physical sense. In a work he titled Al-Shukuk ala Batlamyus, Doubts Concerning Ptolemy, he launched one of the most incisive critiques the ancient model had ever faced. He was not questioning the observations or the mathematics. He was questioning the physical reality of the system itself. Ptolemy, in order to make his predictions more accurate, had introduced a mathematical fudge factor called the equant. It was a point in space, near the Earth, around which a planet's epicycle moved at a constant angular speed. Mathematically, it worked wonders, but physically, Ibn al-Haytham argued, it was an absurdity. It meant that the actual sphere carrying the planet, if such a sphere truly existed as Aristotle had proposed, would have to be rotating at an uneven, wobbly speed. This violated the foundational principle of all ancient cosmology, that the natural motion of the heavens must be perfect, uniform, circular motion. You could have a model that was mathematically predictive, or you could have a model that was physically possible. But in Ptolemy's system, you could not have both. He wrote that Ptolemy had created an imaginary arrangement, a system that cannot exist in actuality. This was a profound critique. He was among the first to insist that a model of the cosmos must not only save the appearances, but must also adhere to consistent physical laws. He did not propose an alternative sun-centered model. That leap was still centuries away, but his doubts created a deep crack in the foundations of the Ptolemaic fortress, a crack that later astronomers, including Copernicus, would exploit to bring the whole structure tumbling down. His curiosity was boundless. He wrote on the density of the atmosphere, correctly deducing that it must have a finite height and relating atmospheric refraction to the phenomenon of twilight. He studied mechanics, exploring the principles of attraction between masses in a way that foreshadowed the concept of gravity. In his Mizan al-Hikmah, the balance of wisdom, he detailed incredibly precise methods for weighing objects in air and water, developing what we would now call specific gravity tables with astonishing accuracy. He even delved into what we would now call psychology and phenomenology, studying how visual perception is affected by memory, experience, and judgment. He understood that seeing is not just a physical process, but a cognitive one. He was, in every sense, a complete scientist, a man whose intellect roamed freely across the entire landscape of natural philosophy, always guided by the same unwavering principles of logic, mathematics, and empirical proof. He left behind a library of over 200 works, a testament to a life spent in the relentless and joyful pursuit of knowledge. And so, our time with Ibn al-Haytham comes to a close. A man who was born in Basra, who rose to prominence in Cairo, and whose mind would eventually illuminate the entire world. A man who, sentenced to a decade of confinement, turned his prison into the most advanced laboratory on earth. He stands as a monumental bridge in our long story. Behind him lies the world of ancient philosophy, of grand systems built on pure reason and eloquent debate. Before him lies the world of the modern science, of meticulous experiment, mathematical modeling, and the humble acceptance that our theories must always bow to the evidence of reality. He stands with a foot firmly in both worlds, connecting them, translating the old questions into a new language. He gave physics its eyes, teaching us how to see the world not as it appears to our fallible senses, but as it can be revealed through controlled experiment. And he gave physics its conscience, insisting that our ideas about the universe must be not only beautiful or logical, but physically true. The light from his dark room would travel for centuries, a single straight ray moving through the quiet darkness of history. It would guide the hands of Renaissance artists, the eyes of revolutionary astronomers, and the minds of the giants who would, in time, build the great edifice of classical physics. He is the quiet hero of our story, the man who taught us to begin, always, by turning down the lights so that we might see a single, simple truth more clearly. Now we are about to begin another journey. This is not a story of light, of things seen. It is a story of an invisible force, a secret whisper from the very heart of our planet. It is a story of a stone, a strange, dark, unassuming stone that held within it a power that would be mistaken for magic, then for divinity, before it was finally understood as a fundamental law of nature. This is the story of the magnetic compass, an invention with no single inventor, a tool that did not burst into the world in a flash of genius, but was slowly, patiently, coaxed from the earth over 1,000 years. It is a story that begins not with a sailor looking for a star, but with a sorcerer looking for a ghost. Our journey begins in ancient China, during the Han Dynasty, more than 2,000 years ago. In the mountains, miners and stoneworkers would sometimes come across a peculiar type of iron ore. It was dark, heavy, and possessed a strange and uncanny property. Small pieces of it would cling to their iron tools. If you brought two of these stones near each other, they would mysteriously push apart or pull together, moved by an unseen hand. They called it Sishi, the loving stone, because of the way it so tenderly embraced iron. We call it lodestone. This phenomenon, which we now call magnetism, was a deep and profound mystery. What was this invisible spirit that lived within the stone? The first uses of this power had nothing to do with finding direction. They were rooted in divination and magic. Court magicians would perform tricks using hidden lodestones to make chess pieces move on their own, or to make gates open as if by enchantment. They were demonstrating their mastery over the hidden forces, the QE, or life energy of the world. But the most sophisticated use of this magical stone was for a practice far more serious, the art of geomancy, or feng shui. To the ancient Chinese, the earth was a living entity, coursed through by invisible rivers of cosmic energy, both benevolent and malevolent. To build a house, a temple, or even to bury the dead in the wrong place was to risk misfortune. To fall out of harmony with the universe, the goal of the geomancer was to find the perfect alignment, the ideal orientation for human endeavors, to harmonize them with the flow of the earth's energy. To do this, they developed a remarkable instrument. It was a divining board, a smooth square plate of bronze, meticulously engraved with a complex diagram of the heavens and the earth, with constellations, symbols from the I Ching, and the points of the zodiac. And at the center of this cosmic map, they would place their most powerful tool, the south-pointing spoon. This spoon was a marvel of craftsmanship. It was carved from a single piece of lodestone, its bowl made heavy and its handle made light, balanced on a small raised nub at its center, so that it could spin with almost no friction. A geomancer would give the spoon a gentle push. It would spin, a blur of motion, before slowly, mysteriously, and without fail, coming to rest with its long handle pointing in a single, unvarying direction. South. Why south? In Chinese cosmology, south was the direction of the heavens, of summer, of the midday sun, of the emperor who faced south when holding court. North was the direction of the cold, the dark, the underworld. The spoon was not finding a place. It was finding the proper, sacred alignment. With its guidance, a palace could be built, a grave could be dug, all in perfect harmony with the hidden currents of the cosmos. For centuries, this was the secret of the whispering stone. It was a key to the spirit world, not the physical one. It was a tool for priests and emperors, not for merchants and sailors. Its handle pointed the way to heaven, not to a distant port. The idea of using this mystical device to guide a ship across the blank, terrifying emptiness of the open ocean was a leap of imagination that no one, for a very long time, was prepared to make. The sea had its own rules, its own gods, and its own guides. The sun, the moon, and the unwavering stars. But these celestial guides were fickle. The sun vanishes at night, the moon waxes and wanes, and on a night of thick, impenetrable cloud, or in a shroud of dense fog, the stars disappear completely. On such a night, a sailor was truly lost, a speck of wood on an infinite, featureless grey canvas, with no way to know if they were sailing towards their destination or into oblivion. For a mariner, a cloudy sky was a form of blindness. This vulnerability, this primal fear of being lost, was the problem waiting for a solution. And the solution lay dormant in the mystical south-pointing spoon. But the spoon itself was not the answer. It was a delicate, cumbersome, and expensive object carved from rare stone. It was a tool for a quiet temple, not the violent, pitching deck of a seagoing junk. For the idea to make the leap from land to sea, the technology had to evolve. The great leap forward came during China's Song dynasty. a period of extraordinary scientific and cultural efflorescence, stretching from the 10th to the 13th centuries. It was an age of explosive innovation, giving the world gunpowder, movable type printing, and a new, more practical understanding of magnetism. The key breakthrough was documented around the year 1088 by one of the most brilliant scientific minds of the era, a scholar official named Shen Kuo. In his encyclopedic work, The Dream Pool Essays, he described a new and better way to create a directional pointer. You no longer needed a rare and carefully carved piece of lodestone. You could impart the stone's mysterious property to an ordinary iron needle. Shenkur described the process with scientific clarity. You simply take the needle and rub its tip repeatedly along the side of the lodestone, always in the same direction. The needle, he wrote, would become imbued with the stone's spirit. It would acquire a potency. Today we call this process magnetic induction. The iron needle itself becomes a magnet. This magnetized needle was a revolution in miniature. It was cheap, it was small, and it was far more sensitive than the heavy spoon. But how do you allow it to spin freely? Shenkur described several ingenious methods. You could take a single fine strand of silk, attach it to the center of the needle with a tiny bead of wax, and let it hang freely in the still air. The needle would twist on the thread until it settled, pointing south. Or even better for use on a moving ship, you could float it. You could place the needle on a small sliver of reed and gently place it on the surface of water in a bowl. The surface tension would hold it afloat, and the water would act as a near frictionless bearing. Unburdened by its own weight, the tiny needle would pivot, aligning itself with the Earth's invisible field. Shenkuo was a meticulous observer. He also noted a curious and important anomaly. He wrote that the needle does not point perfectly south, but always deviates slightly to the east. This is the first known account in history of magnetic declination, the crucial understanding that the direction of the magnetic pole and the direction of the true geographic pole are not exactly the same. It was a discovery of immense practical importance, one that European navigators would not fully grapple with for another 400 years. With the invention of the cheap, portable, and easily made floating needle, the compass was finally ready for the sea. The first definitive account of its use on a ship comes from another Chinese writer, Zhu Yu. In his book, Pingzhou Table Talks, written around the year 1117, he describes the life of a merchant sailor. Zhu Yu writes, the ship's pilots are acquainted with the configuration of the coasts. At night, they steer by the stars, and in the daytime by the sun. In dark weather, they look at the south-pointing needle. There it is. The statement is simple, almost casual, but its significance is monumental. For the first time in history, humanity had a way to navigate without the sky. The bond of dependence on the celestial bodies had been broken. The floating needle in its humble bowl was a secret, artificial star, one that would shine in the darkest weather, in the deepest fog. Chinese mariners refined the technology. They created small lacquered wooden fish or turtles with a piece of magnetized iron inside, floating them in bowls of water. They enclosed the devices in protective boxes with glass tops to shield them from the wind and spray. They marked the rim of the bowl with the 24 primary Chinese directions, creating a highly precise instrument that allowed them to steer with an accuracy previously unimaginable on cloudy days. Armed with this new technology, Chinese sailors became the masters of the Indian Ocean. Their great junks, far larger than any ships being built in Europe at the time, plied the trade routes to Arabia, Africa, and India with a newfound confidence. They were the first to truly conquer the overcast sky, guided by the quiet, persistent whisper of the earth, speaking to them through a tiny sliver of magnetized iron. The secret, however, was too powerful to remain a secret for long. It was about to begin its own long journey, carried in the minds of merchants and travelers, westward, toward a new world. The great highways of the medieval world were not paved with stone. They were the sea lanes of the Indian Ocean and the dusty overland caravan routes of the Silk Road. Along these arteries, goods flowed in a constant, vibrant stream. Silks from China, spices from the Indies, perfumes from Arabia, glass from Persia. But goods were not the only cargo. Ideas traveled too, passed from sailor to sailor in bustling ports, from merchant to merchant in crowded caravanserais. An idea as revolutionary as the magnetic compass could not be contained. Its journey westward is shrouded in the mists of history. There is no single, documented moment of transfer, no famous meeting of minds. Instead, the knowledge seems to have diffused slowly, organically, a seed carried on the wind. It likely traveled along several paths at once. Chinese sailors, using their floating needles, would have demonstrated their art to Arab and Persian traders in the ports of India and the Persian Gulf. Perhaps a merchant on the Silk Road saw a land-based compass being used by a surveyor and carried the memory of it with him. The exact details are lost to us, but by the 12th century, the secret had arrived. The first whispers of the compass in the Western world appear not in a sailor's logbook or a merchant's guide, but in the scholarly writings of an English theologian named Alexander Neckham. Around the year 1190, in two separate works, he describes a curious practice he has either seen or heard of among sailors. Neckham writes with a scholar's detached curiosity. The mariners, he says, when in cloudy weather, they can no longer profit by the light of the sun, or when the world is wrapped in the darkness of the shades of night, and they are ignorant to what point of the compass their ship's course is directed, they touch a needle with the magnet. He goes on to describe the device. It is almost identical to the early Chinese wet compass. The needle is then whirled round in a circle, he writes, and when its motion ceases, its point will look to the north. This is the first unambiguous description of a magnetic compass in Europe. It is a landmark, but notice how Neckham describes it. He does not present it as a new invention or a piece of advanced technology. He speaks of it as if it is a common sailor's trick, a piece of folk magic almost, used in desperation when the heavens fail them. The early European compass was not a standard issue instrument. It was a secret, a last resort for the fog-bound and the lost. The device was likely a simple magnetized needle, perhaps pushed through a piece of straw or cork, floating in a simple wooden bowl of water, a fragile, makeshift tool for a desperate moment. How did it get to this English sailor? The most likely route was through the Mediterranean, the great melting pot of the medieval world. This was the era of the Crusades, which brought thousands of European knights, soldiers, and pilgrims into direct contact with the Islamic world. It was also the era of the great Italian maritime republics, Venice and Genoa, whose galleys dominated the trade routes to Alexandria and Constantinople, where they bartered with Arab merchants, who were, in turn, in contact with the trade networks of the Indian Ocean. In the Islamic world itself, the compass appears in writing a few decades after Neckham. A Persian writer in 1232 tells a story of a fish-shaped piece of iron rubbed with a magnet and floated in a bowl, used to find direction while navigating the Red Sea. By the 1380s, an Arab writer in Cairo describes a dry compass being used as a Qibla indicator, a tool to find the precise direction of Mecca for the daily prayers. It is clear that by the 13th century, the compass was known throughout the interconnected world, from the South China Sea to the North Atlantic. But to know of a device and to perfect it are two different things. The simple floating needle, while revolutionary, was still a crude instrument. It was unstable on a rough sea, the water could spill, and the needle could easily be knocked off its reed. The great innovation, the change that would transform the compass from a sailor's emergency secret into the master instrument of navigation, was about to happen. And it would happen in the bustling maritime workshops of the Mediterranean. The 13th century, the 1200s, was the crucible. The sailors of Genoa, Amalfi, and especially Venice were pushing the boundaries of what was possible. Their trade convoys were the lifeblood of Europe, and any advantage, any technology that could make their voyages safer, faster, and more profitable was seized upon with fierce entrepreneurial spirit. The wet compass was useful, but it was not enough. They needed something better. The first crucial step was to get the needle out of the water. Around the middle of the century, an ingenious solution was developed. A sharp, brass pivot was fixed to the bottom of a small, round, wooden box. The magnetized iron needle had a small brass cap fitted to its center, allowing it to be balanced perfectly on the tip of the pivot. This was the dry compass. It was a masterpiece of simple, effective design. The needle could now spin freely in the air, with even less friction than it had on the water's surface. It was more sensitive, more stable, and no longer at risk of spilling or sinking in a storm. The entire device could be held in the palm of a hand. But a pointing needle alone is not enough. To steer a course, a sailor needs a frame of reference. The next great innovation was to place a card, a fly, directly beneath the needle. At first, this card was marked with only the 4 cardinal points: north, south, east, and west. A simple cross to make it easier to read in the dim light of a ship's cabin. The north point was often marked with a spearhead or a simple T-shape for tramontana, the north wind. Over time, this card became more and more elaborate. The 4 points were subdivided into 8, then 16, then 32 distinct directions. This marked disc became a thing of beauty and utility, an object we now call the compass rose. To make the north point stand out even more, artists began to adorn it with a stylized fleur-de-lis, a symbol of royalty and purity, a design that became a near-universal standard. By the end of the 1200s, the design was perfected. The magnetized needle was attached directly to the underside of the compass card. Now, the entire card turned as one unit, a stable, readable dial showing all 32 directions. The box was covered with a pane of glass to protect it from the elements, and the whole apparatus was placed in a gimbal mount, a set of concentric rings that allowed the compass to remain level, no matter how violently the ship pitched and rolled beneath it. The compass had come of age. By 1274, Venetian workshops were producing these advanced, reliable instruments as standard equipment for their trading galleys. What had begun as a geomancer's mystical spoon in China was now a mass-produced, scientifically engineered tool in Italy. The impact was immediate and profound. Before the compass, sailing in the Mediterranean was a seasonal affair. The winter months, from October to April, were known as Mare Clausum, the closed sea. The weather was too unpredictable, the skies too often overcast for safe navigation. Ships stayed in port. With the arrival of the reliable dry compass, this changed forever. For the first time, sailors could keep their bearings in the winter storms. The sea was never closed again. This simple wooden box unlocked the calendar, effectively doubling the shipping season. Trade convoys could now run year-round, leading to an economic boom that further fueled the prosperity of the Italian city-states and the entire European continent. The compass did more than just make existing routes safer. It made new routes possible. It emboldened sailors. It gave them the psychological confidence to sail out of sight of land, blue water sailing, knowing they possessed a thread, an invisible connection back to the world they knew. It was not a perfect tool. Sailors quickly learned about the strange variation that Shen Kuo had first noted, the deviation from true north that required clever correction. They learned that a large iron cannon placed too close could fool the needle, a phenomenon they called deviation, and they learned that a close lightning strike could rob the needle of its magic entirely, leaving them truly lost. But despite its imperfections, the compass was a declaration of independence. Independence from the stars, independence from the coastline, independence from the weather. It was the key that unlocked the oceans. By the end of the 13th century, the Whispering Stone had completed its long journey. From the mystical divining boards of the Han Dynasty, across the deserts and oceans of the medieval world, to the pragmatic hands of the Venetian sailor, its secret was finally out. The stage was set. With this small, powerful, and reliable guide, humanity was now poised to complete its map of the world, to embark on the great age of discovery, a journey that would be steered every nautical mile of the way by the quiet, constant, and unwavering pointing of a magnetized needle. And so, the journey of the Whispering Stone reaches not an end, but a transformation. What began as a tool to align the soul with the cosmos became the tool that allowed the body to cross the globe. Its power was not diminished in this transition. It was magnified beyond measure. In our story so far, we have spoken of individual geniuses, of Thales, Aristotle, and Ibn al-Haytham. But the story of the compass is different. It is a story without a singular hero. It has no father, no famous inventor, whose name is recorded in the history books. An Italian folk legend from the 16th century tried to assign its invention to a mythical navigator named Flavio Gioia. But this has been thoroughly debunked by historians. The truth is more profound. The compass was not invented, it was discovered. It was a gradual unfolding, a slow dialogue between human curiosity and a fundamental property of our planet. The Chinese geomancers first heard the whisper. The Song dynasty engineers learned to amplify it. The Arab traders carried the echo across the world, and the European sailors finally learned to trust it in the heart of the storm. It belongs to no one culture, but to the collective interconnected story of human ingenuity. There are, of course, debates and mysteries that linger like sea mist. Did the Vikings use some form of lodestone compass to navigate the foggy North Atlantic? Did the Olmecs of ancient Mesoamerica truly craft a similar device from hematite 1,000 years before the Chinese? These are tantalizing questions, but the evidence remains faint, controversial. The main current of our story, the clear, traceable line from east to west, is the one that changed the world. The compass, as it stood perfected at the end of the 1200s, represents a pivotal moment in the history of physics and human thought. For the first time, humanity was placing its trust, its fortune, and its very life in a tool that operated on a force that was completely invisible, intangible, and unexplained. Sailors did not know why the needle pointed north. They did not know about the molten iron core of the Earth generating a vast magnetic field. They did not understand poles, or dipoles, or induction. They only knew that it worked. It was a leap of faith, but not a leap into the supernatural. It was a leap of faith into the consistency and reliability of the natural world. It was a profound statement that there are laws of nature that we can trust, even if we do not yet understand them. This humble wooden box, with its spinning card, laid the physical and psychological groundwork for the great age of discovery that was to come. Without it, the voyages of Columbus, of da Gama, of Magellan are simply unimaginable. It was the quiet, unsung hero of global exploration, the silent partner on the deck of every caravel and galleon that sailed into the unknown. Now, this is the story of a world before clear sight. For thousands of years, the dimming of vision was a fundamental tragedy of the human condition. It was a natural tax levied by time. A child might be born with imperfect sight, destined to navigate a world of shadows. A scholar, after decades spent poring over manuscripts, would find that the letters he had dedicated his life to had begun to betray him, swimming before his eyes. A skilled artisan, a jeweler, an illuminator, a clockmaker would find their hands still steady, but their eyes no longer able to guide their craft. The fading of one's sight was the closing of a door, the gentle, inexorable end of a productive life. There were hints, whispers of solutions. The Roman historian Pliny the Elder wrote that the Emperor Nero, a man known for his excesses, would watch the gladiatorial games through a large polished emerald, which seemed to soothe his eyes and magnify the distant spectacle. It was a curiosity of the powerful, not a solution for the masses. In the quiet scriptoriums of medieval monasteries, a more practical tool emerged. Monks, whose life's work was the painstaking copying and illumination of sacred texts, developed what they called reading stones. These were simple, beautiful objects, a hemisphere of polished quartz crystal or glass, placed directly onto the parchment. The dome-shaped crystal would act as a primitive magnifying glass, making the small, dense script larger and easier to read. It was a vital tool, but a cumbersome one. It had to be moved laboriously across the page, line by line. It was a stationary aid, not a part of the person. You could not look up from your book and see the world through it. The world was waiting for a miracle, a way not just to magnify a small portion of a page, but to restore clarity to one's entire field of vision. And like so many of our stories, the foundation for this miracle was not laid by an inventor in a workshop, but by a thinker in a quiet room, wrestling with the fundamental nature of light itself. The theoretical spark, as we have seen, was ignited by the great Arab scientist of the 11th century, Ibn al-Haytham. His book of optics, which methodically explored how light travels, reflects, and refracts, was the foundational text. When it was translated into Latin in the 12th century, it electrified European thinkers. Men like the English bishop Robert Grosseteste in the early 1200s read these new translations and began to experiment with the properties of lenses. He wrote of how a lens could be used for reading the smallest letters at an incredible distance. His student, the brilliant and controversial friar Roger Bacon, went further. Around the year 1262, Bacon wrote with astonishing foresight, describing how segments of a glass sphere could be shaped to make old men and those with weak eyes see the smallest letters sufficiently clearly. He was describing the principle of eyeglasses. He had the theory. He understood the physics. But there is no evidence that Roger Bacon ever built or wore a pair. The idea was in the air, a theoretical possibility, waiting for a craftsman's hands. It was waiting for a place where the art of glassmaking had reached a level of sophistication that could turn this beautiful theory into a practical, wearable reality. That place was 13th century Italy. The breakthrough, when it came, was not announced with a thunderclap. There was no royal decree, no patent filed. It arrived as a whisper in a sermon. In the year 1306, a Dominican friar in Florence named Giordano da Pisa was speaking to his congregation. In an offhand remark, meant to illustrate a point, he said, "It is not yet 20 years since there was found the art of making eyeglasses, which make for good vision. And it is so short a time that this new art, never before extant, was discovered." He continued, adding a personal, tantalizing detail. "I, myself, have seen and conversed with the man who made them first." Let us pause on that statement. Not yet 20 years. This simple phrase allows us to date one of the most important inventions in human history with remarkable precision. It tells us that sometime around the year 1286, in this vibrant region of northern Italy, most likely in Pisa, the first true eyeglasses were created. Who was the inventor that Giordano met? His name is lost to history. A 17th century forgery tried to name him as one Salvino Dalmati, but this has been thoroughly debunked. The truth is likely more collaborative. In the same monastery as Giordano, another friar, Alessandro della Spina, was described in the monastery's chronicles as a brilliant and generous man. The chronicles state that he saw the eyeglasses that had been made by this unknown inventor. He figured out how they were made, and then he made them for all with a cheerful and willing heart, sharing the secret freely. So, we have no single inventor. We have an anonymous creator and a generous promoter. The invention was likely the product of the unique environment of 13th century Italy, a place with a high concentration of skilled glass artisans, a growing population of literate merchants and clergy, and the recently arrived optical theories of Ibn al-Haytham. It was not a single eureka moment, but a quiet, collaborative miracle. What did these first eyeglasses look like? They were a world away from the designs we know today. They were called rivet spectacles. They consisted of two small, round, convex lenses, ground from either quartz, or more commonly, glass. Each lens was held in a simple frame made of bone, metal, or boiled leather. The two frames were then joined together at the handles by a single rivet. There were no arms, no earpieces to hook behind the ears. To use them, you would either hold them up to your eyes with one hand, like a masquerade mask, or you would simply pinch them onto the bridge of your nose. This pince-nez style would have been precarious, prone to slipping, but for a scholar sitting at a desk, it was a revelation. These early lenses were all convex. They bent light inward, magnifying what was close. They were a solution for one specific problem: presbyopia, the age-related farsightedness that makes reading difficult for nearly everyone over the age of 40. For the first time in history, the blurring of the written word was no longer an inevitable curse of aging. The center of this new industry quickly became the city of Venice. The Venetian Republic was the undisputed master of glassmaking in the medieval world. Their closely guarded secrets, practiced on the island of Murano, produced the clearest and most flawless glass in Europe. As early as 1301, the Venetian guilds had established regulations for the makers of roidi da ogli, discs for the eyes. The city's vast trade network then became the engine for the invention's dissemination. Venetian galleys, loaded with spices, silks, and other luxuries, now also carried small, precious cargoes of these new vision aids. The technology spread with incredible speed. It was a self-evident miracle. You didn't need to be convinced by an argument. You simply had to try on a pair. Peddlers and merchants would travel with an assortment of lenses of different strengths, graded not by a scientific prescription, but by the age they were intended for. A customer would simply try on different pairs until they found the one that brought the world into focus. By 1352, just a few decades after their invention, eyeglasses were common enough to appear in art. In a fresco in Treviso, the artist Tommaso da Modena painted a portrait of Cardinal Hugh de Saint-Cher, hunched over his desk, diligently writing, with a pair of rivet spectacles perched firmly on his nose. The image is clear. Eyeglasses had become a symbol. They were the emblem of scholarship, of wisdom, of a life dedicated to the careful study of the written word. The impact of this simple device is almost impossible to overstate. It was a revolution that happened on the faces of thousands of individuals, a quiet, personal, yet world-altering change. It effectively doubled the scholarly lifespan. Before eyeglasses, a scholar, a lawyer, a theologian, or a merchant might have been at the peak of their wisdom and experience in their 40s or 50s. But their ability to work would be crippled by their failing sight. They would be forced into retirement, their accumulated knowledge locked away, unable to engage with the fine print of a contract or the dense text of a philosophical treatise. Eyeglasses changed this completely. They allowed the most experienced and knowledgeable members of society to remain intellectually active for another 20 or 30 years. This created an unprecedented accumulation of knowledge and expertise. The rise of the new universities across Europe was fueled by this technology. It accelerated the pace of thought, allowing for more books to be read, more manuscripts to be copied, and more ideas to be debated. The invention of the printing press by Gutenberg around 1440 poured fuel on this fire. Suddenly, books were cheaper and more plentiful than ever before, and an entire population of aging readers was now equipped to consume them. The impact on science, or natural philosophy, as it was then known, was profound. Observation is the bedrock of all science, and eyeglasses made observation sharper, more precise, and more sustainable. An astronomer could now spend longer hours charting the faint movements of the stars. A naturalist could more clearly discern the delicate veins on a leaf. An alchemist could better observe the subtle color changes in a distillation. This new tool trained the human mind to believe that its natural limitations could be overcome with ingenuity. If a simple piece of shaped glass could correct the flaws of the human eye, what else was possible? The understanding of lenses, honed by centuries of eyeglass making, was the direct technological and intellectual precursor to the two most important instruments of the scientific revolution: the telescope and the microscope. Johannes Kepler, in the early 1600s, was the first to fully explain the science of optics that made both the eye and the eyeglass work. His work would have been unthinkable without the centuries of practical, craft-based knowledge accumulated by the anonymous artisans who had been grinding lenses for spectacles. Eyeglasses taught us how to manipulate light. The telescope and microscope were simply the next logical steps, allowing us to manipulate light, not just to see the page in front of us more clearly, but to see worlds hidden in the heavens and in a single drop of water. The simple rivet spectacle was only the beginning. The technology continued to evolve. By the mid-15th century, craftsmen had learned how to grind concave lenses, which bend light outwards. These were a solution for myopia or nearsightedness, allowing those who had lived in a blurry world to see distant objects with clarity for the first time. The quest for comfort and stability continued. In the 1700s, the London optician Edward Scarlett is credited with inventing the rigid arms or temples that hook behind the ears, creating the design we know today. Around the 1780s, the American statesman and inventor Benjamin Franklin, tired of switching between two pairs of glasses for reading and for distance, created the first bifocals by simply cutting two lenses in half and mounting them in a single frame. In the 20th century, materials science revolutionized the craft with the invention of lightweight, shatter-resistant plastic lenses and advanced coatings that could reduce glare and even darken in sunlight. Eyeglasses transformed from a purely medical device into a statement of fashion and identity, but their fundamental legacy remains. They were arguably the first piece of wearable technology to directly augment the human sense. They democratized clear vision, breaking the monopoly that youth held on the world of detailed work. They stand as a testament to the power of a simple solution to a universal problem. From the first anonymous artisan who riveted two lenses together to the billions of people today whose lives are made clearer and more productive by this invention, the story of eyeglasses is the story of a second chance. It is the story of a gift, the gift of a second sight, the gift of a clearer, sharper, and more brilliant world. A stone dropped from the hand, an apple from a tree, a raindrop from a cloud. It is an act so common, so fundamental to our experience, that we rarely stop to think about it. But for millennia, the explanation for this simple act was rooted in a deep and powerful philosophy, a philosophy given to the world by the great mind of Aristotle. In the Aristotelian universe, as we have seen, everything had a purpose, a telos, and everything had a natural place. The natural place for earthly things was the center of the universe, which was, of course, the earth itself. A rock, when you release it, is not being pulled by an invisible force. It is simply expressing its own nature. It has an inner urge, a desire, to return to its home. From this simple, elegant idea, a seemingly obvious conclusion followed. A larger, heavier rock, being more earthy, must surely have a stronger desire, a more powerful urge to return home than a small, light pebble. Therefore, Aristotle concluded, heavier objects must fall faster than lighter ones. A 10-pound weight would fall 10 times faster than a 1-pound weight. It was a beautiful, logical, and deeply satisfying explanation. It fit perfectly within his grand, purposeful cosmos, and, for the most part, it seemed to match our everyday experience. A feather flutters slowly to the ground, while a stone plummets. It was common sense, and for nearly 2,000 years, from the schools of ancient Athens through the Islamic Golden Age and into the great medieval universities of Europe, this was not a theory. It was a fact. To question it was to question the very foundations of natural philosophy. But the world was changing. A new spirit of inquiry was stirring in the late Renaissance, a spirit nurtured by the rediscovery of ancient mathematicians like Archimedes and the rise of a new class of practical-minded engineers and artisans that was beginning to value empirical evidence over ancient authority. The stage was being set for a confrontation, and the man who would step into the center of that stage was a young, brilliant, and fiercely independent mathematics professor in the city of Pisa. His name was Galileo Galilei. Galileo was born in Pisa in 1564. He was not born into a world of abstract philosophy. His father, Vincenzo Galilei, was a renowned musician and music theorist, a man who, in his own field, was a revolutionary. Vincenzo taught his son to distrust blind authority and to trust what could be demonstrated through experiment. In his case, the mathematical relationships between the tension of a string and the musical pitch it produced. This empirical, hands-on spirit was in Galileo's blood. He was sent to the University of Pisa to study medicine, but he quickly grew bored with the rote memorization of ancient texts. He fell in love with the clean, irrefutable logic of mathematics and geometry. He was a brilliant but difficult student. He questioned his professors, challenged established doctrines, and earned the nickname the Wrangler. By 1589, at the young age of 25, his genius could not be denied, and he was appointed to the chair of mathematics at the very university where he had been such a troublesome student. It was a poorly paid position, but it gave him the freedom to pursue his true passion, the study of motion. During this time, he began to write a series of unpublished essays, which we now know as de motu, or on motion. In these pages, we can see the birth of a revolution. We see Galileo systematically dismantling the Aristotelian view of the world, not with angry rhetoric, but with the cool, sharp tools of logic and mathematics. And it was here that he turned his full attention to the ancient law of falling bodies. Does a 10-pound ball really fall 10 times faster than a 1-pound ball? Had anyone ever actually bothered to check? Galileo began to doubt. His skepticism was not just a hunch. It was a deeply reasoned suspicion. And from this suspicion, a legend was born. The story is one of the most famous in the history of science. It is an image of pure, dramatic intellectual combat. The young, defiant Galileo, standing before the assembled professors and students of the university, climbs the winding staircase of Pisa's famous Leaning Tower. In his hands, he carries 2 cannonballs, one large and heavy, the other small and light. He stands at the top, silhouetted against the sky. He holds the 2 balls out over the edge and lets them go. Down they plummet, side by side. The crowd below watches, hushed, and in a single, resounding thud, they strike the ground at the very same instant. The 2,000-year-old wisdom of Aristotle is shattered in a moment of public, irrefutable proof. It is a magnificent story. It is the story of evidence triumphing over dogma. The only problem is, it probably never happened. The story first appears in a biography of Galileo, written by his last pupil, Vincenzo Viviani, more than a decade after Galileo's death. There are no accounts of this dramatic public demonstration in any of Galileo's own extensive letters or notebooks. Most historians now view the story as an apocryphal tale, a legend created to capture the spirit of Galileo's challenge, rather than the literal truth of his methods. Similar, less dramatic experiments had even been conducted by others before him, like Simon Stevin in the Netherlands a few years earlier. The public spectacle of the Leaning Tower was likely not Galileo's way. His true weapon was far more powerful and far more subtle than a pair of cannonballs. His true experiment took place not on a tower, but in the quiet, limitless laboratory of the human mind. Galileo's most elegant refutation of Aristotle was a thought experiment. It required no equipment, only the power of pure logic. Imagine, he said, we take 2 objects, a heavy one and a light one. Let us call them a cannonball and a musket ball. According to Aristotle, the cannonball, being heavier, will fall faster. The musket ball will fall slower. Now what happens if we tie the 2 balls together with a short piece of rope? Aristotle's theory now forces us into a logical paradox. On the one hand, the slow musket ball should act as a drag. a kind of parachute, slowing down the speedy cannonball. So, the combined system should fall slower than the cannonball alone. But on the other hand, the combined system of the cannonball plus the musket ball is now heavier than the cannonball alone. Therefore, according to the very same Aristotelian rule, it should fall faster. The theory predicts that the combined object will fall both slower and faster than the cannonball alone. This is a logical impossibility, an absurdity. The only way to escape this paradox is to conclude that the original assumption that heavy and light objects fall at different speeds must be wrong. They must fall at the same speed. This was Galileo's true genius. He had toppled a 2,000-year-old pillar of physics without leaving his study, using nothing but the sheer force of reason. But Galileo was not just a philosopher. He was an experimentalist. He knew that logic must be supported by physical evidence. Dropping objects from a height, however, was a messy and difficult experiment. The fall is too fast to time accurately with the water clocks and pendulums of his day, and the subtle effects of air resistance can easily confuse the results. So, he devised a more clever experiment. He decided to slow gravity down. He took a long, smooth wooden board and cut a straight groove down its center. He then propped this board up at a gentle angle, creating an inclined plane. He would roll polished bronze balls down this groove. This was, in effect, a diluted form of falling. It was slow enough that he could time it accurately, using a water clock that measured time by the weight of water flowing out of a small spout, or even, as his father had taught him, by the steady rhythm of musical beats. Patiently, meticulously, he would roll the balls down the ramp, over and over, from different starting points, at different angles, and he discovered a beautiful, simple, mathematical relationship. He found that the distance the ball traveled was always proportional to the square of the time it had been rolling. If it rolled 1 unit of distance in 1 unit of time, it would roll 4 units of distance in 2 units of time, and 9 units of distance in 3 units of time. This mathematical law, S equals 1/2 gt squared, proved something profound. It proved that the ball was not just rolling, but that its speed was increasing at a perfectly steady, constant rate. It was undergoing uniform acceleration, and crucially, he found that this law held true no matter the weight of the ball he used. A heavy ball and a light ball both picked up speed in exactly the same way. In the quiet of his workshop, with his ramps and his water clocks, Galileo had done something revolutionary. He had replaced Aristotle's qualitative, purpose-driven physics with a new physics of quantitative, mathematical description. He was no longer asking why things fall. He was asking how they fall, and he was answering with the precise language of mathematics. He understood, of course, that in the real world, a feather falls slower than a cannonball. But he correctly identified the reason: air resistance. He argued that the fundamental law of gravity, the uniform acceleration of all bodies, is only truly visible in a vacuum, a space with no air to get in the way. In the real world, air pushes back more effectively on a light, broad object like a feather than on a dense, heavy object like a cannonball, causing them to fall at different rates. The underlying law, however, remained true. This simple, powerful idea that all objects fall at the same rate in the absence of air became a cornerstone of physics. Galileo left Pisa in 1592, but he would spend the rest of his life refining these ideas, leading to his formulation of the law of inertia and a complete theory of projectile motion. His work on motion paved the direct road for Isaac Newton, who, a few decades later, would take Galileo's terrestrial law of falling bodies and expand it into a universal law of gravitation that governed the fall of an apple and the orbit of the moon. The legend of the Leaning Tower endures because it captures a great truth, even if it is not a literal one. It represents the moment when the book of nature was seen not as a collection of ancient philosophical texts, but as a thing to be read directly through the language of experiment and mathematics. Hundreds of years later, in 1971, during the Apollo 15 mission, Commander David Scott stood on the surface of the moon, a world with no air. In one hand, he held a geological hammer, and in the other, a falcon feather. He held them out and let them go. In the stark, silent vacuum of space, the hammer and the feather fell together, side by side, and struck the lunar dust at the very same instant. It was a beautiful televised tribute, a final stunning confirmation of the revolution that began with a simple doubt in the mind of a young professor in Pisa. And now, it is time for the mind to rest. Let your thoughts too succumb to the gentle pull of sleep in a universe where everything falls, finally, into its rightful place. Sleep well, and until our next brilliantly boring journey together,